Hello and welcome back to Away with the Pharaohs. I'm excited to be joined today by a colleague.
Yeah.
I have here sat with me in the EES library, just above where we work, Edward Scrivens.
Hello.
So he is our development manager, in charge of raising essential funds to make sure we can continue our important work to support and promote Egyptian cultural heritage. But you didn't start off there. You do have an Egyptological background. So you did your PhD at the Queen's College University of Oxford. And you had a studentship there, right?
I did indeed, yes. I was the Barnes student, so the Barnes studentship in Egyptology, doing a research on the representation of goddesses in the New Kingdom of Egypt. So we're talking here, the period I was looking at, between 1290 and 1070 BC, roughly, something like that.
Yeah, really interesting. And that's partly why we've invited you today. But just a little bit more on your background. You also taught at Swansea University for a time.
Yes.
And some of our audience may recognise you from some of our own courses that you've taught.
Absolutely.
Some on gods and goddesses and religion and mythology, which we'll be talking about a little bit more. And outside of Egyptology, you are a comedian.
I am indeed, yes. Which is sort of a fun thing, I think, the stuff we do here at the EES, because it sort of brings together that world of being interested in ancient Egypt and also interested in talking to people in fun ways. And so that's been quite a useful thing for me. But yeah, improv comedian, largely drag performer as well. And then sometimes hieroglyphs too. So, whatever people let me turn my hand to.
Well, great to have you here, Ed. And thank you for joining me on Away with the Pharaohs. Today, we're going to be answering the question, did Egyptian gods and goddesses empower everyday worship or reinforce state control?
That's a spicy question.
It is. And of course, Egyptian religion is such a popular topic. I think many people may have studied it at primary school or have come across it at some point in their lives. And especially if you've seen museum collections on Egyptian objects, it comes into play. So I think a great way to start would be maybe to introduce the concept of religion before we dive into our divine beings, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, but as you say, like an introduction, but by no means a small question in terms of what is religion, and especially what is religion in ancient Egypt, really. So if you and I are chatting about religion, then which, coincidentally we are in this instance, we might think, religion is a collection of beliefs and or practices. So things that you think or feel accompanied by things that you do. So be that rituals you carry out, festivals you attend, ways that you live your life. And much of that we can apply to ancient Egypt. But the thing is that religion as a category, as a term, is probably not something that the ancient Egyptians themselves would have recognized. They, as far as we could see, did not have a word that translates to religion, just as much as they also didn't really have a word that neatly translates to art, for example. Some of these concepts are perhaps a bit more reflective of our own cultural history and context, where these kind of spheres of life are sort of separated out. Whereas in ancient Egypt, I think the existence of the gods and goddesses, in fact, wasn't just some matter of faith. It was sort of a fact of life. They're just a part of the world. So I would say, in terms of what is religion in ancient Egypt, it's largely a classification that we put onto it to try and describe a lot of the practices and phenomena that we're seeing. But broadly speaking, religion in ancient Egypt was the stuff that people did to maintain good relationships with the divine, the gods and goddesses, who not only ruled the world around them, but were very much part of the world around them, and your interactions with them were part of your everyday existence.
That's so interesting. Yeah, great to pick up on the fact, there wasn't a word for religion or art. It's important to recognise our own personal biases when we're looking back into the past. It's something we've picked up on a few times in the podcast. But
absolutely.
I think especially with religion, it's a very interesting concept that we will only be able to go over briefly today?
Well, yeah, exactly. It sort of feels like a huge, almost philosophical topic, right? But dipping our toes into the pool just a little bit.
Inspiring you to maybe go find out more after you've listened.
Well, yeah. And there are some great places to do that. I mean, one that I could mention is the EES's very own book, Ancient Egypt in 50 Discoveries, which has a little piece about Egyptian religion written by yours truly. So I wrote the bit on ancient Egyptian religion. And so there's lots of great stuff there. Also, good places for people to start, I would say, actually, if people could get their hands on Conceptions of God in Ancient Egypt by Eric Hornung, and also Ancient Egyptian Religion, Gods, Myths, and Personal Practice is another good one. So these are quite good places for if you do want to delve into this a bit more and engage with some of these ideas. If you can pick those up, then those are great places to start, especially the Ancient Egypt in 50 Discoveries one.
Not to toot our own horn.
Not to toot our own horn, obviously.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for those recommendations. So yeah, let's dive in then to gods and goddesses specifically. Mm-hmm. So I would love to know, I mean, there are hundreds of gods and goddesses, right? If you can pick just one, what would your favourite god or goddess be?
Oh, that's really hard. Oh, no. I think, well, as again, someone who has researched goddesses and continues to do so, I think a strong contender perhaps for my favourite ancient Egyptian deity is the goddess Hathor. So she is a very ancient and very complex goddess. She's often described as being a goddess of love, for example, which is true, but that's only very much part of her identity. So Hathor is often represented with the horns of a cow or a cow's head or entirely as a cow. And that can link to this idea that she is this almost mother goddess type figure and associated with fertility and womanhood, but also sexuality. And that this, as well as having kind of sort of motherly, nourishing aspects, there could also be this sort of unbridled, tempestuous aspect. And that kind of links into Hathor's role as one of the various goddesses who are part of a very strange sounding umbrella term called the Eye of Ra. So Ra is the sun god, and there is a particular goddess called the Eye Goddess or the Eye of Ra, who is a manifestation of the sort of destructive, protective, maybe avenging power of the sun and the sun god. And various goddesses can have this title of the Eye of Ra, and Hathor is one of them. In fact, one of the main ones. So there's a whole myth where she nearly destroyed humanity and had to be placated with wine, which I understand. So as well as that, she is a goddess of music and sensuality and of the afterlife too, because she sort of controls or has a role in birth in this world, but also into the next world. And she's a very long-standing Egyptian goddess. She really comes into her own sort of when the Great Pyramids are being built, roughly. So we're talking about 2500-ish BC, something like that. And it's during that time that you get this surge of the cult of the sun god, and kind of tied into that is her importance and where she is part of, for example, the mythology around queens, and that the queen is connected to Hathor as much as the king is connected to the sun god and other gods. So she's probably a contender for my favorite, but there were several others that were all vying for position.
I can imagine there's a lot to choose from.
Yeah.
But I think that's a brilliant start to our discussion about maybe some of the key gods and goddesses. We won't go through all of them because it shows how multifaceted they are, right?
Yeah. I think it really does show how multifaceted and complex they are, and that in ancient Egypt, it's not so much a case that there is a god of X and a goddess of Y. It's more that gods and goddesses can do lots of different stuff and can appear in lots of different forms and be in multiple places at once, and are these fluid, multifaceted beings. It's just that perhaps they tend to be associated with certain things, but they can kind of do anything. And I think it also shows the kind of role that Egyptian myth plays, because myth and mythology in ancient Egypt is quite different to, let's say, in Greece or the classical world, because it is so fluid and it changes. And part of that is that the kind of function that myth has is to give power to ritual. It's not really that these myths and stories are being created in order to create a sort of encyclopedic history of the world. It's more that you're trying to do a ritual and create a certain effect, and you sort of turbocharge it with a story or a set of symbols. And that's kind of how you get all these different stories and faces. And that in one version, it's one god who does something, but in another version, it's another one. And those versions coexist and they don't challenge each other. And that's because I think Egyptian religion, to use that term, and myth, it operates on a different level and in a different way to a lot of, to use the terms modern Western thinking does. It's not either or, it's and. Everything is very multiple and it points towards these larger truths. It's not kind of something can only be one thing or another thing. It's a very different way of approaching the world, I think.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Very much that grey area or overlap area rather than, black and white.
Yeah, totally. And it's not that, you know, they kind of were just getting it wrong and being lazy. It's that this material is just doing very different things, and it speaks to a very different worldview. So you were saying, so these mythological stories and rituals and things, they act in a certain way to possibly create a certain outcome. Would you say that's why most of the gods and goddesses existed in Egypt? That's a very interesting question. I think, yes, in terms of a lot of people have the same or similar concerns, right, throughout time, be that wanting to remain healthy or keep danger away. And so I think that sometimes wanting those effects lead people to reach for meaning and to reach for the things they think can help them with that. And so maybe that's part of one of the driving force of how some of these things come together. But I think alongside that, there is also the drive that these things can have of their own, that you're looking at the landscape around you and the world around you, and understandings or ideas or thoughts about what things might be present themselves, and through that these ideas evolve. And of course, you're going to be inheriting ideas from the people who came before you. You're also possibly going to be being told things in terms of from maybe people in authority, or from, to tie back to the central question of this episode, from the state or the people who are running these big temples and building them. You might potentially be being told how things are, or you'll see, this shrine to this god that, you know, is our local god, and maybe the shrine is made out of sort of perishable materials, has got some royal sponsorship, and now they're building a bigger stone version. And so maybe that speaks to people a bit as well in terms of where the power is and where it's moving. So I think you said it earlier, it's a very fluid topic, and it's hard to pin down in the time we have today. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think it would be great now if we could move into some examples. We've already mentioned a couple. Yeah. But I wonder whether we could talk about the, shall I say, family tree of the gods of ancient Egypt. Yeah. Well, that's, again, like you say, it's a very fluid family tree. It's more of like a family puddle that sort of ebbs and flows and changes into other things. Family marshland, maybe. So one of the main ones, I think, we can't really talk about religion in ancient Egypt without talking about the sun god. The sun god is, as I said earlier, from the time that we're coming to build pyramids right in the early days of the Egyptian state, the sun god is becoming increasingly important and is one of the main figures in Egyptian religion. And there are many forms of the sun god, Ra or Re being a classic one that people may have heard of. But you'll also get deities like Khepri or Khepri. People may have heard of him too. So that is a form of the sun god who is a scarab beetle. Particularly connected to the rising sun, and the sun kind of as it is freshly reborn from the horizon. And there are many reasons for that. One being that the scarab beetle, the dung beetle, can be seen to push along these balls of dung as it's going about its day. And also that word that is written with the scarab hieroglyph, cheper, means also to happen, to kind of come into being, which all ties into this idea that this is the form of the sun god who kind of comes into being from the horizon. But there are many other forms of the sun god, notably, famously, among Egyptologists certainly, was this particular form called the Aten. Listeners may have heard people talking before about the Amun-Ra period. We're talking roughly 1350 BC. That was a big rupture, really, and lots of stuff in ancient Egypt in terms of how traditional religion was practiced, the way the art looked, everything. So the Amun-Ra period is essentially the time surrounding a particular figure who we now know as Akhenaten. So Akhenaten was once known as Amenhotep IV, but when he came to the throne, he seems to have pretty quickly decided he didn't want to do things in the conventional way. And he really liked this form of the sun god Aten. Aten or Iten means disc. So this is a form of the sun god that is particularly focused on the sun disc as it appears in the sky. Originally, he is depicting the Aten kind of like traditional ancient Egyptian gods in terms of a combination of human and animal features. He's human with a bird head, a falcon head, a very classic sun god way to look in ancient Egypt. But before too long, Akhenaten changes the way that this god is depicted into quite an abstract form. So it's shown to be the literal physical sun disk with rays of light coming down from underneath it and hands at the end of those rays, often handing out or holding the Ankh symbol, so that hooped cross that is the symbol of life. And that's really the core of what the Aten is. So essentially, Akhenaten was worshipping the life-giving light of the sun itself, which then really changes the way that the sun is looked at and worshipped, because outside of this time and before this time, the journey of the sun across the sky was quite mythologized. Thinking about it in terms of the sun god is born from the horizon in the morning. He journeys across the sky in his sacred boat. He is then, swallowed by the sky goddess at the western horizon, and then goes down through the underworld and has to fight and get around all manner of enemies and difficulties, culminating in a battle with Apep or Apophis, who is this giant serpent demon god. Some people call him a demon or a monster or a god. I'd lean god myself, just a bit of a scary one. And once he's defeated him, creation is reassured, and then he is reborn from the horizon again. But when you get to the Amun-Ra period and this new ideology of the Aten, at that point, it's a very different way of thinking about the sun. It's all based on sort of physical observations of the sun's journey rather than this mythology of being in a special boat that goes across the sky and then you fight this thing. It's all these almost philosophical conclusions in terms of, the sun is far away, yet we feel it on our skin and see the effects of it around us. Therefore, the sun god is both distant and near, and he is alone, he is singular, which is why perhaps Akhenaten seems to have almost gone to the extent of being a monotheist, or maybe flirting with it. Yes, he certainly didn't like other gods, or at least he didn't want to promote the worship of other gods, especially what had before then been the chief state god, which is Amun or Amun-Ra, whose chief temple was at Karnak in modern-day Luxor. So yes, an interesting time and a very different take on the sun god.
Yeah, it's so interesting because you've just reeled off many different names for essentially the same god or deity in a way. And it's interesting to see that, the sun, which was obviously quite apparent in Egypt, it still is today.
Still is if you go,
And it's interesting to see, that key natural element celebrated so much throughout Egyptian mythology, magic, religion. whatever term we should be using.
Yeah, for sure. Because it's, like you say, it's kind of all pervading when you're there, and the effects of it are so apparent, and it gives life, but also can be dangerous. And it's such a powerful force in the landscape and in your life if you're in that environment. So of course it makes sense that it's so prominent in Egyptian myth.
Definitely.
You don't have to be a member of the Egypt Exploration Society to listen to Away with the Pharaohs, but if you're enjoying this and want to explore further, then visit our website where you'll find additional facts, guides, discounts and events exclusively for members.
Okay, so you mentioned Amun. Let's talk a little bit more about him.
Yeah, so Amun may be known to some people listening out there by the name of Tutankhamun, for example. So he shows up in Tutankhamun's name. So Amun, he was the chief god of the Egyptian state, really speaking from the New Kingdom onwards. So the New Kingdom begins around 1550 BC. And he's a god who seems to have his sort of core and his center around Thebes. So again, modern day Luxor, down in the south of Egypt. And he is in many ways probably some of the closest that we could see within Egyptian religion to almost a kind of modern idea of God, if that makes sense, that he is almost transcendent and distant, but personal. There are texts saying that Amun hears the prayers and cries of people who call out to him. So he's this huge state god who has basically the largest temple on earth almost at the time. And indeed, I think the temple complex of Karnak might still be one of the largest religious structures on earth, depending how you count it, which is always the caveat. So he is this sort of massive entity, but also has this quite personal dimension to him as well. And his name itself, Imen Amun, means hidden. And that also communicates something about the sort of nature of Amun, is that he is both personal and ultimately kind of unknowable, but his sort of perhaps more famous and powerful manifestation was as Amun or Amun-Ra, the sort of king of the gods, certainly, as I say, by the time we get to the New Kingdom. And he has this solar dimension indicated by the Ra aspect. So that's something that once you start looking at Egyptian gods and goddesses, you'll start noticing that lots of them seem to be stuck together in these groupings. And that's something we call syncretism, where these deities can sort of fuse almost, or perhaps to put it another way, they participate in each other. So they kind of maintain their own individual realities, but they also have this sort of shared being that is created. And so Amun-Ra is one where, especially as the cult of Amun became more and more important, he was sort of syncretized or fused onto this long-standing, very important solar god of Ra. So to really mark it out that, okay, this is the big cheese now. So we're showing everyone that Amun-Ra is, as his title suggests, because if you read the inscriptions, it often will say Amun-Ra, king of the gods, the sort of most powerful of them all.
Yeah. And I wonder whether we can run through a few other well-known or popular gods and goddesses our audience may have heard of.
Yeah, well, there's various gods and goddesses who have made it into popular culture and have become even adopted by other cultures in order to worship them. So, for example, the family of gods that comprise Osiris, Isis, and Horus. So these are very important to Egyptian kingship and indeed to ancient Egyptian ideas of the afterlife. So Osiris was famously the god who was once in the Egyptian myth a sort of ruling king of Egypt. He was definitely a god and a divine being, but
originally gods were thought to have walked among humans, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There was a time when gods ruled on earth, and over time, that sort of, I suppose, got handed down to their descendants and their descendants and their descendants. And then you end up with the sort of human semi-divine pharaohs that we have.
Which we'll be coming back
to. But there was once upon a time when Osiris was the ruler of the earth. And his brother Seth did not enjoy this. Seth was a god of the desert and storms and generally a bit of a chaotic entity. Not evil, but a bit tempestuous. And Seth was jealous and so murdered Osiris, and depending on the version that you look at, drowned him, chopped him up into little bits, all of the above. And what eventually happened, Isis, this goddess, a great, powerful magician, she was able to restore Osiris, essentially making him the first mummy. And from that point, he becomes the god of the afterlife. And so that's why Osiris is hugely important, and people may well have heard of him. If you see a god or a figure in Egyptian art who looks like a mummy with a tall white crown, maybe a green face, the likelihood is that that is Osiris and his wife Isis and their son Horus. So he is one of these gods who appears with a falcon head frequently. He is a god of the sky, of kingship, and Horus battled with his uncle Seth in order to reclaim the throne of his father Osiris. Some of the more entertaining and lurid episodes of that being in the contendings of Horus and Seth. And that whole episode of the murder of Osiris and his resurrection and then the reclaiming of that throne by Horus was a very important episode for ideas of kingship in ancient Egypt. So it didn't just form a blueprint for what resurrection and life after death might look like, which it very much did. It also was a blueprint for the king's own power, I suppose, because the living king was an incarnation of the god Horus. And then when he died, he became Osiris, basically. And so then his successor, perhaps his son, perhaps someone else, his successor would then take on that role of the living Horus. So it's sort of a bit of a conveyor belt, almost of like divine rule.
That's so interesting. How divine power transitions to the king on Earth.
Yeah, absolutely. It gives the king and the state and the status quo, I suppose, the justification it needs. It gives it a sort of base of power. But I suppose it would be a bit too cynical to say it was only for that function. I don't think that this was almost window dressing or myth making for the sake of it. For one thing, because these myths really permeate everything, even the ideas of the universe and how it worked and the function of the king within that. For example, this idea of Ma'at or Ma'at, which is the concept of kind of universal balance and order, the proper order of things as created right at the beginning of everything. And the role of the king was to maintain that by things like building temples, making sure that things are ruled properly in the land, but also things like foreign wars and putting down those pesky, rebellious people from across the borders who might threaten Egypt. And of course, you could read that as being propaganda, right, for why the king is important. But it seems to be so in-depth and entrenched. I think it goes beyond that. I think it's very much something that was truly felt in different ways, though I always say that multiple things can be true at once, and they probably did take advantage of it for propaganda reasons at various points. But perhaps it also brought with it a whole series of pressures and responsibilities that were quite keenly felt.
Yeah, definitely. So we've touched upon the king and his link to the gods. I think it would be great to dive into his connection between the gods and the everyday person.
Yeah. So the king is sort of the crossing over point, I suppose, if you're looking at humanity on one side and the gods on the other side. He's the center of that Venn diagram, and he's both part of humanity and related to the gods, or maybe a god in waiting, or a god to be. He has divine aspects to him. But the interesting thing to me alongside that, though, is that the king wasn't necessarily the only human being who could do that. So there are examples of non-royal people who go through a process of, we might say, deification, who become deified and worshipped as deities after their death and in later periods. And so that could take multiple different forms. Sometimes it's sort of more as what we might, I guess, call a local saint or an ancestor or something. So everybody in the Egyptian mindset when they died would go through some kind of transformation, right, into some form of more than human being. Often these are referred to as, transfigured spirits, or is the ancient Egyptian word, AKH. So this is a person who has died and gone through the necessary transformations, been sort of judged before the gods of the afterlife and accepted in, and so then you are this transfigured being. So we would all kind of get, all going well, if you used your Book of the Dead properly, then we would all have that certain kind of deification, but some figures seem to have gone a bit further and become important to the communities maybe that they once lived in, for example. And then some would go on to properly be fully worshipped as gods. So one example of this being Imhotep. And I'm not talking here about the one from the Mummy. I'm talking about the architect of the Step Pyramid. So this is sort of right towards the start of the Old Kingdom of Egypt, about 2600 BC. The Step Pyramid was the first pyramid and the first substantial stone building on Earth, really. And the architect of that building was this person, Imhotep. Over time, he became revered as this very wise figure, very accomplished. And by the time you then get to the later eras of Egyptian history, certainly, as I say, by the time we're thinking about Cleopatra and, as we say, Ptolemaic, so kind of Macedonian Greek descended dynasties. By that point, Imhotep is fully deified. He is worshipped as a god of healing and other sort of intellectual pursuits and has temples. So it's perhaps a bit of a scale. Some people even seem to have been deified because they died in funky ways. Yeah, I mean, this is a thing more in the later periods of Egyptian history, but it seemed that there were some deaths that seemed to almost put you closer to the divine in a strange way. Like if you were killed by a crocodile, for example, like a kind of sacred animal.
How interesting.
Yeah, so it's not godhood or goddesshood wasn't something that was only an option for royals. I mean, it largely was, quite often was, but private individuals could become deified themselves.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And an aspect of Egyptian culture that I think is often overlooked in favour of the king. I mean, of course, away with the pharaohs, we have to give the pharaoh a spotlight, but it's nice to shine it on other people sometimes. Can we talk a little bit more about how we possibly could see the everyday person worshipping, and are there any tidbits from places that give us more insight into that?
Yeah, I think so. Well, one way that we can see certainly people having been present in some of these sacred spaces, even some of these big state temples, is you'll sometimes find things like parts of statues or walls that have been touched and rubbed over a long period of time or many times. So that could show that people are coming to this space and they're touching particular parts of it, maybe in order to get a personal contact with the deity or the space, or feel that personal connection. Maybe there's a particular symbol or part of the monument that they feel is special, so they want to touch it. So that can be sort of evidence of that. We can also see instances where people have brought things like their own small stelae, so these small inscribed objects or other kinds of inscribed objects. Maybe they brought them in order to be dedicated within the temple. Sometimes these might be given to a priest who is able to go inside, because not everyone would have access to the inner areas of the temple. It's different to thinking of a church. There was a great podcast about that earlier in the series, in fact.
I would recommend going back to listen.
So I just remember one particular text that I read during my master's, which was a letter to a god that was on a little piece of papyrus and written by or on behalf of a woman. And she basically sends this letter in via her friend who is a priest to go in and deliver it to the god. So presumably the statue, the divine statue within the inner sanctuary. And it basically says, why are you staying in your shrine all the time? What's the good of you if you never come out? And she's really frustrated with this god. He's saying, well, what's the point of you if you never come outside your shrine? And by that, she is probably referring to the fact that during festivals, the sacred statue in the temple sanctuary that the kind of spirit or presence, I suppose, of the god inhabited would often be loaded onto a sort of carrying shrine, often in the shape of a boat, and brought out of the inner parts of the temple. That would be an opportunity for people who are visiting the temple for the festival to see at least the carrying shrine, the sacred bark, but also probably certain kinds of divination might happen there. So you would ask a question or chuck sometimes a little flake of stone or pottery with your question written on it in front of the group of priests carrying the carrying boat. And if it rocked towards you, it was a yes. If it rocked backwards, it was a no. So people would sometimes use these opportunities to directly ask the gods, like, I've got this problem, can you tell me about it? And she obviously was getting impatient and asked the god, why don't you come out?
That's so interesting. I mean, we started this episode saying that, of course, the concept of religion and faith is very different in ancient Egypt than it is today. Yeah. However, it's stories like this that make me connect with those people.
Yeah, exactly. But then that's the thing, isn't it? It's sort of, in that sense, it's religion, and there is belief there, or if maybe assurance that the god is there. There's something almost very mundane about it, in terms of it's more like you're talking to a supervisor you're not very happy with, rather than this sort of mystical deity who is a matter of faith. Clearly, for this person who wrote or had this letter written, there was no question as to whether or not the gods were real or not. He was, and he was annoying her, which is quite funny.
Yeah, that's so interesting. We've spoken a lot about the more popular gods, but there are examples of more domestic gods, right?
Yeah.
Rather than big major gods of certain areas of Egypt.
Yeah, so there are gods and goddesses whose remit, I guess, can be quite close to home, quite personal, quite everyday, such as things to do with the physical home or with childbirth and other sort of matters of personal life more than national life. But also there are gods and goddesses who are attached to specific places. Maybe they are the deity of a town or a village, or they might be associated with a particular natural feature. So I'm thinking, for example, about gods like Bes, who is often associated with childbirth and protecting the family and the home in that way. But also I'm thinking of goddesses like Meret Seger. I mean, she's an interesting example because she sort of is a goddess of quite high importance, because she is basically the goddess of the west bank of Thebes. So the western bank of modern day Luxor, where places like the Valley of the Kings is, as well as sites like Deir el-Medina, which was the village that the tomb builders lived in, who built the Valley of the Kings and Valley of the Queens. So that is clearly, she's an important goddess, therefore, but also very, very local, and seems to be attached to particular features in the landscape. Like, she's sometimes referred to as the peak, which seems to be a reference to the physical sort of desert cliffs or outcrops of the Theban West Bank. So she is very much part of that very local landscape. And I think that is one of the ways to come back to one of the central questions of the podcast about whether these gods and goddesses and these beliefs bolster the state. Are they just, vehicles of power for the king and the state? In many ways, yes. But examples like that, I think, are interesting because they're not about the king and the state, or they are very much about local places. They're not about centralizing everything. And if anything, they draw people's attention, their identity, their sense of belonging back to, the town that you're from and very particular things and places, which at certain points in Egyptian history could be very disruptive to the king and to the central government, because listeners may have heard people talking about kingdoms upon kingdoms and lots of different things. But between these so-called kingdoms, so these times of quite centralized, stable political control, there are what are often called intermediate periods. So when the country of Egypt essentially fragmented or would have several rulers, or, there's no strong central government. And so your local ruler or elite family is the, sort of calling the shots. And so at times like that, one could say that these local gods or goddesses were actually a bit of a thorn in the side, maybe, to any attempt to be kind of governing over everything, because it reminded you of specifically where you were from and like where your family, had their roots, rather than these big nationwide deities.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And we often talk about nomes, which are different regions of Egypt.
Yeah, not the small, things with hats and beards.
Yeah, no Gs. So gnomes are similar to the states in the US, for example. Those gnomes would have nomarchs, which were rulers of those areas. And each of those had their own god or goddess, right?
Yeah, absolutely they did. They would have gods or goddesses who literally embodied the gnome. And they could also have some of these, perhaps even more national gods and goddesses, would also have an attachment to a particular gnome. Maybe that gnome is where the center of their cult is, or a god may have, associations with several different gnomes. But there's that tension, I guess, between the bigger picture and the local picture. And they kind of both go together. They're both vying maybe at certain times and complementing each other other times. So big complex jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah. Thank you so much for explaining this. Very intimidating is the wrong word, but overwhelming subject.
Exactly. You never get your head entirely around it. I think the thing, as you say, in terms of this idea of it maybe being intimidating or overwhelming, I suppose what I might say as a piece of advice is to slightly let yourself be taken by the wave of it, as in accept that it is not something that one could ever fully understand and have your entire head around. And indeed, maybe that's kind of the point, that to the Egyptians, the divine and the divine world was this huge, always changing, complex thing that any one perspective can't fully describe. And so perhaps giving ourselves to that fluid, almost kaleidoscope of it is almost one of the better ways and closer ways to engage with it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's a brilliant piece of advice to close on.
Oh, great.
Well, I think that all that's left for me to say is a huge thank you to Edward for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It's been great.
Thank you all for listening.